results. Again, plateau pressure of 40 centimeters of water on the left with low dynamic strain. We see no gross injury in either the acutely injured tissue or the normal tissue, either on the gross tissue or on the cut surface. However, with the same high plateau pressure, with a high dynamic strain, large tidal volume, we see extensive damage in both the baby lung and in the acutely injured tissue, both grossly and on cross-section. So we conclude from this study that over-distension alone does not cause villi in either the normal baby lung tissue or the acutely injured tissue. It surely does, we believe, exacerbate injury if you also have a high dynamic strain. So what's the knowledge necessary to reduce villi? What's our physiologic knowledge that we would need in order to come up with a better mousetrap, with a better way to protect the acutely injured lung? So we have to drill down into the lung, and we really have to look at the normal mechanism of dynamic alveolar inflation and deflation, because this is really where the rubber meets the road. What happens at that alveolar level with each breath? Do these alveoli over-distend? Do they open and collapse, or are they stable? And once we understand the normal mechanisms of alveolar dynamics, then how does ARDS change these mechanics in order to make the lung so highly susceptible to secondary ventilator-induced lung injury? And using this knowledge of normal and abnormal mechanics, we can design a mechanical breath profile. And what I mean by that is all of the volumes, pressures, flows, and rates, and more importantly, what the amount of time that each of those components of a mechanical breath are applied during inhalation and exhalation would be necessary to reduce or eliminate villi. So essentially what we want to do is take these normal alveolar mechanics and then with our mechanical breath, reestablish normal dynamic alveolar ventilation. And if we can do that, then villi should be eliminated. So what's the current concept of villi mechanisms? And these, again, this is the unique concepts, what many investigators, including our group, are starting to find, that rather than overdistension of the baby lung, that the actual mechanisms of villi at the alveolar level are regional alveolar strain. And again, remember, strain just means change in size with each breath. And this is caused by alveolar instability, alveoli that actually open with inspiration and collapse during expiration, the classical recruitment, derecruitment that you've heard about for many years. And also a newer concept called stress multipliers. And this occurs in normal inflated tissue surrounding tissue that's going through recruitment, derecruitment, or tissue that's totally collapsed or edematous and is not is not involved with each ventilatory cycle. It just remains collapsed or edema-filled with no air during expiration or inspiration. And it's this regional lung strain that's actually the mechanism driving villi. And I'm going to go into each of these in some detail. So first we have to know, what do normal alveolar mechanics look like? And we have a very unique tool, an in vivo microscope. And with this in vivo microscope, we can look at subpleural alveoli in living animals. In this case, it's a rat. And each of these little globes here is an individual alveolus. And you can see that they're all interconnected. Alveoli share walls. They're not individual grapes, but each alveolus shares a wall with its neighbor. And this sharing of walls is called alveolar interdependence, and it's highly important in stabilizing normal alveoli and establishing these normal alveolar mechanics. And notice how little these alveoli move with each breath. We've measured it over the years, and it's around a 2% change in size with each breath. The majority of the change in lung volume is not in changes of alveolar size, but in changes of the alveolar duct size. The duct size is made up of elastin. It's actually made up of all of the alveolar mouths that are forming the astinus. And again, the tissue type is elastin, which is designed to stretch. And so the duct stretches and de-stretches during each breath. And this allows the alveoli to remain very stable. And remember, alveolar walls are just two cells thick, about half a micron. It's an epithelial cell, an endothelial cell, and a basement membrane. Obviously, these two cell microanatomy is not designed to stretch and unstretched like a rubber band. However, the elastin in the alveolar duct is. So this makes perfect sense from a microanatomical perspective also. We model alveolar mechanics in our laboratories in these interconnected hexagons. And again, the key that you have to remember is the alveoli are not individual grapes. They are interdependent. Each alveolus shares a wall with its neighbor. And if we model this 2% change, this is the kind of change in size we would see of the alveolus with a normal breath. Again, the majority of the volume change is going to be taken up in the alveolar duct. So what are the abnormal mechanics? So how does ARDS change these normal, stable, interconnected, interdependent mechanics and to make the lungs susceptible to acute lung injury or a ventilator-induced lung injury? So what does instability look like? Again, we're going to use our in vivo microscope. This is a rat lung with stimulated ARDS. You can see this is the apical lobe and this is the diaphragmatic lobe. You can see the lung lobe right here. I specifically chose this shot because you can see the lung is being ventilated with a mechanical ventilator. This is not static. This is an alveolar duct coming right out to the edge. And you can see that with each breath, alveoli open and collapse with each breath. So you are actually visualizing classical alveolar recruitment, derecruitment. You can see the same thing occurring over here in the diaphragmatic lobe. And you can imagine the tremendous stresses and strains that are being put on those tiny alveoli, just 2 cells thick, endothelium and epithelium with each breath. A really good way to think about it, Marcelo Amato, I heard in a lecture once, said just take a paper clip and bend it back and forth 4 or 5 times and it's going to break. And that's exactly what's happening to these alveoli. So the goal of protective mechanical ventilation is to try to convert these abnormal mechanics with large dynamic strain back into that normal 2% change with each breath. Again, so we're going to model this with our hexagons. And in the center here, this would be the alveoli that are collapsing and expanding with each breath. And you can see it's going to be the paperclip effect, and those cells are going to be damaged very quickly, and we're going to have a great deal of edema and consolidation, and that tissue is going to be unusable in a very short period of time. But notice the other component that is occurring here. Because these alveoli share walls, look what's happening to the neighbors that are inflated. They're being overdistended with each breath, and there's a much bigger strain or change in size with each breath. So not only are the surfactant deficient alveoli that are collapsing and expanding damaged, the adjacent stresses or the stresses are being amplified or multiplied in the surrounding tissue. So this is the first demonstration of what we call these stress multipliers. So this is the damaged tissue, this is the normal tissue, but stress is being multiplied in this normal tissue with each opening and collapsing of the unstable alveoli, causing a stress concentration in these areas. So what exactly do I mean by these stress concentrators or stress multipliers? And I think the simplest way to think of it is just taking a board and putting some defects in it. So in this case, we're doing an experiment. We want to see how much force it will take to break this board. And so we're going to pull on the board from both directions. And this will generate lines of force, which in a board without defects are parallel and spaced widely apart. So as we know, you're going to have to really pull on that board in order to get it to snap. However, if we put defects in the board, it's going to make it much, much easier to break. You can see how the lines of force are concentrated around the oval defect, even concentrated greater around the square defect, and how highly concentrated they are with this V defect. And there's nobody's going to doubt that exactly where that board's going to break when you pull on those 2 lines. And that's all we mean by stress multipliers. Same thing occurs in the lung. So again, if we use our hexagons system, we see with the hexagons, all the alveoli are open, they're interconnected, they're nice and stable. As you apply your tidal volume, the lines of stress are equally distributed, and that lung is going to be very difficult to hurt with your mechanical breath. However, if we cause edema or atelectasis that stays totally collapsed throughout the ventilatory cycle, these lines of force are going to be concentrated in these areas. You can see the distortion of the inflated alveoli. It's going to multiply the stress in this area just like it would in that board. And here's where your progressive injury is going to take place. So what's going to occur is with each breath, this collapsed part these collapsed or edema-filled alveoli are going to expand these alveoli are going to collapse or become edema-filled, and you're going to just get a wider and a wider and a wider expansion from these areas of stress concentrators until your whole lung is involved, and it's going to be very difficult to keep your patient alive. Again, an animation of this, of a stress multiplier. Here we have our edema or collapsed atelectatic tissue. And notice with inspiration and expiration, how the alveoli alveoli surrounding the defect are overdistended, and they have a much larger dynamic strain. They change size more greatly than that 2% with each breath. So this is the concept of stress multipliers, and stress multiplier in conjunction with their recruitment de-recruitment are really the current hypothesis of the actual mechanisms of Billy in the acutely injured lung. And again, there is overdistension, but it isn't overdistension of the normal tissue. It's overdistension of normal tissue that's surrounding a stress multiplier. So you really need the stress multiplier in order to overdistend the tissue. If you just try to overdistend tissue without a stress multiplier, with stable alveoli, without any edema or atelectasis, it just won't occur. So with this knowledge, how do we reduce Billy? So now we know the mechanism, at least that's the presumed mechanism today. There surely is still some controversy, but I think, at least in my opinion, the overwhelming data suggests that these recruitment, de-recruitment, and stress multipliers are the really driving force in Billy. So if this is true, what do we do? So obviously it's simple. We eliminate alveolar instability and stress multipliers, and of course that's probably much easier said than done. It's been tried for for 2 decades, and we've used all of these combinations in order to try to protect the lung. So what's the missing component? There has to be something we're not thinking about, and if we can come up with that one missing component, maybe we can have a paradigm change in the way medicine is practiced. And we and many others believe this component is time. The time that you apply the mechanical breath during inspiration, and the time that you apply the mechanical breath during expiration. And also secondarily, the time that you use this protective ventilation strategy. In other words, we expect to see a gradual improvement over the time that the patient is on the ventilator. So again, our group and many others have shown that extending time at inspiration and a short time at expiration would be superior to low tidal volume and PEEP at reducing this regional lung strain, these stress multipliers, and recruitment, de-recruitment. So why does time play such an important role in parenchymal tissue mechanics? And that's because the lung tissue inflates and deflates as a viscoelastic system. And this is very important. I'm going to go into some great detail to sort of describe this viscoelasticity. The thing is, the problem is many believe that the lung is sort of like a balloon. You put X amount of pressure in and you immediately get X amount of change in volume. You take X amount of pressure or volume out and you immediately get that same immediate volume change. But in viscoelastic system, there's a time lag from when you apply your tidal volume and the lung actually recruits, and from when you exhale and the lung actually collapses. And this viscoelasticity is what we're going to take advantage of in designing our mechanical breath. So engineers teach viscoelasticity with a tool called the spring and dash pot. And here we see the force. In the case of a lung, this would be the tidal volume. And we have a spring attached in parallel with a dash in a pot. And this pot is filled with various fluids. It could be something very viscous like honey, and then the dash pot would move very slowly, or it could be something non-viscous like water, and the dash pot would move very rapidly. But the key thing is to see that you apply the force and there's continual movement. If the spring and the dash pot were alveolar tissue, you can see that as you apply the force, the tissue is still moving. It hasn't actually come to rest. It hasn't fully expanded or fully collapsed. And so we get this relatively rapid movement, which is the spring component, or rapid strain, as the engineers would say. And then you get a much slower strain with the dash pot. And this is going to depend on the viscosity of the fluid in that dash pot. And from a lung perspective, in a normal tissue, normal lung, the fluid would be more like water, so that dash pot would move quite quickly, and your lung would fully inflate very quickly with the mechanical breath. With ARDS, that would be more like honey, and you're going to take a long time at the applied pressure until you get those alveoli fully opened up. And so again, what is the key thing to remember about the viscoelastic system? That there's a time lag from when you apply the tidal volume or release the tidal volume, exhale, and you get a change in size of the alveolus. So it's not an immediate change, but there's a time lag between both alveolar opening and alveolar collapse. And it's this time lag that we're going to address, and we're going to try to modify our ventilation strategies in order to more effectively open it and recruit these alveoli and remove recruitment, derecruitment, and stress multipliers. So as all of you probably know, Dr. Abashi had developed this time-controlled adaptive ventilation, or TCAV method, to set and adjust the APRV mode. And the key component of this TCAV method, and again, this is just the method to set and adjust the APRV mode using APRV mode, but we have several decades of research now, is that APRV has to be set precisely correct in order to work based on this viscoelastic concepts of tissue opening and collapse. And so we're still using the APRV mode, but in all instances that I'm going to show you, since that is from our laboratory, we always use the TCAV method to set and adjust the APRV mode. So just a quick refresher of what a APRV or a TCAV adjusted APRV mode would look like. We have a pressure and a flow curve over time, and we have a very extensive T-high. So again, we want an extended time at inspiration to recruit those viscoelastic alveoli, and we have a very short time at expiration, in an attempt to try to not give those viscoelastic alveoli time to collapse. So here we have our spring and dash pot. In this case, we're going to apply the force of the tidal volume, and then we're going to hold it. And as you see, as long as we're holding it, we get a continual movement of that dash in the pot. Okay, and if we look at the breath, see what's going on here. This is that extended time at inspiration. And so we inspire and we hold it. This is our extended CPAP, and alveoli can recruit, recruit, and recruit. As long as we're holding that breath, we get continual recruitment of alveoli with each breath. So we get breath-to-breath recruitment of alveoli. And what we believe is that the TCAV method is going to nudge your patient's lung open over several hours. It's not like a rapid recruit maneuver, try to get the whole thing open in one big bite. We're going to slowly recruit this lung, and maybe 6, 12, 24 hours later, your patient's lung will be fully open. And again, here we see the spring and the dash pots. The spring immediately moves up, and then the slow increase in the dash pot with the hold. And we can see that we get a continual increase in that movement over time. So what the spring and dash pot tool teaches us about viscoelastic tissue is the longer that you apply your inspiratory pressure, the more alveoli you're going to get open with each breath. Now, I want to show you biological evidence for these hypotheses. And these are rat lungs with ARDS from our laboratory. And you can see the pink here is the remaining open tissue, and this is the collapsed and edema-filled tissue. And what we're going to show is we're going to apply a pressure of 40 centimeters of water. And in this case, we're going to hold it for 1 second, which is about a typical time at conventional mechanical ventilation during the inspiratory phase. And here we're going to hold the same pressure. And the key thing is to remember the pressure is the same in both of these. The only thing difference is the time that it's applied. So in this would be a TCAV breath. We're going to hold this for 5 seconds, which would be a typical length of time the TCAV breath would be held. And so if we hold that pressure for 1 second, we see almost no change. No, the atelectasis is still all there, no popping out, no red changing to pink. Watch what happens when we use the same exact pressure, hold it for 4 more seconds. At about 2 seconds, we get a good size recruitment, and you can see the continual recruitment over time of the red tissue going to the pink tissue. So this is biological evidence that it's not just the pressure you apply to the lung, but the amount of time you apply that pressure that's going to get your alveoli to open. And why is this true? It's because alveoli open and collapse is a viscoelastic system. And in this case, we have an ARDS lung, which the fluid in that dash pot is more like honey than water, and it takes a long time at a given pressure in order for those alveoli to open. Now let's look at the other phase, at expiration. So now we're going to have a very, very quick expiration, and we can see the spring's going to collapse, but look at here. The dash pot does not have time to move. So over here we see that this is during that very quick release phase. With APRV set with the TCAV method, this is almost always a half second or less in patients without comorbidities like COPD or emphysema. What we see is that the expiratory duration is so quick that we actually just don't have time for that dash pot to move. So we get some collapse. Most of it would be in the alveolar mouths with the elastin, but we get very little change or very little collapse in the alveolus. Again, here we see the spring and dash pot. We can see the spring collapses very quickly and then a slow collapse over time as the alveoli, as the dash moves through the pot. And we can see if we stop our breath early, we will prevent all of this continued de-recruitment over the 5-second expiratory phase. So this is a spring and dash pot tool to demonstrate why a short expiratory duration will not give time for these viscoelastic alveoli to collapse. Here's the biological evidence. This is a rat lung with ARDS. You can see a very long expiratory duration here, and what happens during that expiratory phase, that long expiratory phase, alveoli collapse. Here we shorten, all we did here is shorten the expiratory phase, and now you see the alveoli have perfectly stabilized. So again, the only thing we did different here is shorten the expiratory phase in order to obtain alveolar stability. Again, another look at it here is our inspiration, our whole with inspiration, and our de-recruitment. This is along with the blue being collapsed and the pink being inflated. With a longer inspiration, we continually inflate alveoli until we get the entire lung inflated over time. And if we keep the lung with a very short expiratory duration, it doesn't end up collapsing. It simply does not give viscoelastic alveoli a time to collapse. So again, thinking about the problem, it appears that we can use the mechanical breath component or profile component of time in order to open and stabilize these ARDS injured alveoli. So sort of a recap of the problem. ARDS mortality, I think everyone would agree from the recent meta-analysis is still unacceptably high, that the current tools of low tidal volume PEEP recruitment maneuver have not further reduced mortality over the last 20 years, that the mechanism of alveolar recruitment, de-recruitment, and stress multipliers is actually driving ARDS pathophysiology. And it's much less likely that overdistension of the baby lung is actually the real problem with mechanical ventilation. The key thing is that alveoli don't inflate and deflate like an elastic balloon, but rather as a viscoelastic system. Another way to think of the viscoelastic system is like the piston in your spring door or in your storm door. As you go out the storm door, it closes quickly initially and then slowly shuts back down. And so a viscoelastic system is like that piston. That's the spring in the dash pot component of a viscoelastic system. So if you think about that, that's how alveoli open and close. ARDS makes the lung time and pressure dependent. And I think this is a very important concept. And what do I mean by time and pressure dependent? It means that in the ARDS lung, it will collapse very quickly at atmospheric pressure. So unless we do something to essentially help the lung out, we need to, one of the terms we use is apply a cast to the lung. The lung has surfactant deficiencies, it has edema, it's not going to stay fully inflated at atmospheric pressure like our normal lungs do. So we have to add a crutch or a cast to the lung to keep it open. And if we keep it open and stable, villi will disappear and the lung will heal much quicker. And what we found is, again, due to this viscoelasticity, if we use a long inspiratory and a short expiratory time, we sort of put a cast on a broken lung, like putting a cast on a broken bone. Put a cast, you break your arm, you put a cast on it, you reset the bone, put a cast on it, but then you have to let it heal. Same thing with the lung. So you have a lung with ARDS, you put this TCAV method of APRV to cast the lung open. So now you've taken this sick lung and you've opened and stabilized it with this very unique combination of pressure and time. And now you have eliminated these stress multipliers and recruitment, de-recruitment, and you've stopped the villi. So now all the patient has to worry about is getting over whatever caused their ARDS, and they will recover fully. So it essentially, if you can cast the broken lung open, it will eliminate villi as a secondary problem or secondary mortality associated with ARDS. And again, we believe that the TCAV method of setting adjusting APRV is optimal compared to the other methods out there. And I will show you, we have multiple publications. TCAV is by far and away the most studied method from both the basic science, mechanistic, and efficacy. And we do have a few clinical papers. I wish we had more, and we are working on them. But it's a highly studied method to set and adjust TCAV, or set and adjust APRV. I will show you a list of the papers that we have published. So I want to just show you like sort of one study in each of the different components, or each of our different categories. This would be in our laboratory that I showed you in the opening slide, in our translational laboratory by Dr. Roy, who studied in my lab for 2 years. He compared low tidal volume and non-protective ventilation to the TCAV method. And although we will say APRV throughout, the APRV was always set and adjusted using the TCAV method. And so again, we compared this, we compared the ARDSnet low tidal volume, and we set it at 6. We came out to 5.77 with a standard deviation of 0.38 in the TCAV method, in which we did not adjust for tidal volume. We just set the T high, the P high, and the T low. P low with the TCAV method is always 0. We measured the tidal volume, but we didn't set it. And the tidal volume at the end of the study, end of 48 hours, was 12 cc's per kilo. So you would think that the TCAV method would be very injurious, and the ARDSnet low tidal volume would have been far superior. But let me show you the results. This is, again, time in hours. This is a 48-hour model of sepsis-induced ARDS, and this was tidal volume in late low tidal volume applied after the animal desaturated, just like you would in the clinic. Early low tidal volume as soon as we injured it, and APRV set and adjusted by the TCAV method. Also early, because that's when Dr. Abashi applies TCAV. His criteria for TCAV is intubation. Every patient that's intubated goes immediately on TCAV. It works for lungs in normal patients. It's very personalized and adaptive, regardless of the condition of the patient's lung. And what we saw is that in the case, all of the animals started out with a tidal volume of 10. And then over time, as I mentioned, the tidal volume in the TCAV group went up to 12. And of course, the tidal volume by definition of the low tidal volume was 6. However, when we look at compliance, again, we all start out with normal compliance, and this is normal compliance for a 30-kilo pig, much lower compliance than humans, of course, but this is the normal range. And we see that with the TCAV method, compliance does not go down. In some cases, it actually goes up, where we have a continual drop in compliance in the group with the 6 cc's per kilo. And so it's very important to remember that it's not just the size of the tidal volume you're blowing into the lung, but the size and the compliance of the tidal volume you're blowing of the lung that you're blowing that tidal volume into. And I'm going to mention this a little more detailed. So although we had a higher tidal volume, we had a much better compliance. And this is really sort of I think the take-home message. This is at necropsy. Both of these lungs are blown up to 25 centimeters of water. And in the TCAV lung, again, we had tidal volume was 12, but the driving pressure due to that very high compliance was only 9 centimeters of water. In the ARDSnet method, we had low tidal volume, but our driving pressure was very high, 27 in the dangerous range, because of that very low compliance. So again, it's not just the tidal volume, but also the size of the lung and the compliance to that tidal volume that will actually determine the driving pressure. And as you all know from Mato's New England Journal of Medicine paper a few years ago, it's the driving pressure which correlates with lung pathology, not the size of the tidal volume. And you can see in the cut surfaces here, there's no edema in the airway or the interlobular spaces, and a great deal of edema here, and you can see the interlobular edema. And of interest, these animals, including the TCAV, since we don't control the septic source, we leave the bacteria in the abdomen to cause a raging sepsis for the full 48 hours. They were as much as 60 liters positive with fluid, and still we pull out a normal, non-edematous lung. And to this day, this slide gives me goose pimples because I was absolutely shocked. I've been at this business for, again, 45 years now, and I've never seen a treatment in this severe of an injury that works this well. It's really, truly amazing, and I plan on studying the TCAV method for the rest of my career. It still has a lot of secrets that I have to unravel. So this is a statistical clinical study using the TCAV protocol published by Penny Andrews and Dr. Abashi. And what they did is they compared 15 other SICUs, and that's the bar and whiskers, with their data from Maryland shock trauma. And their data from Maryland shock trauma is the little black O. So first they looked at the injury score, the ISS, and you can see that Maryland shock trauma, that their patients were in a higher UPOR trial, so their patients are as injured or more injured than the other 15 SICUs. They looked at percent ARDS, and the TCAV method, it was almost off the bottom of the chart. It was 14% ARDS versus 1.3, and for in-hospital mortality, again, almost at the bottom of the chart, 14% versus 3.6%, and all of these patients died of something else other than ARDS. So very, very impressive results from this meta-analysis. They also looked at the LIPS, the LIPS points of the lung injury prediction score, and the higher the number from 1 to 8, the higher the percentage that you should develop ARDS. In the study that I just showed you, they had a LIPS score of 8.7. That should have given them a mortality of 35%, but instead the mortality was 1.3% with TCAV. So not just a slight reduction in the amount of incidence, but literally an order of magnitude. So again, these are prospective studies, meta-analysis, or retrospective studies, not a prospective study. But still, the numbers are so highly dramatic that I think it's really trying to teach us something. The TCAV method is personalized, adaptive, directed by changes in lung physiology. I literally could give another hour lecture just on this component, but I wanted to show you quickly on our animal models and some brain-dead lung donors exactly what I mean. So here we have non-protective ventilation strategy, APRV set and adjusted by TCAV and low tidal volume. Here's our tidal volumes. And we're going to look at ultimately that driving pressure, tidal volume, chest wall and compliance are all used to personalize the settings for TCAV. And we're going to just look at driving pressure here. And you can see that they all start out around the same driving pressure of around 10. But over the 48 hours in the TCAV group, the driving pressure never goes up. As compared to the non-protective group where the driving pressure is almost 40, and the total low tidal volume group where the driving pressure is 30. And yet with these high driving pressures, we had tidal volume of 10, tidal volume of 6, and a tidal volume of 12. So again, these much lower tidal volumes do not equate to lower driving pressures. And why is that? It's because driving pressure is equal to tidal volume over the chest wall or over the respiratory system compliance. And as you recall from previous slides, the respiratory system compliance does not fall using the TCAV method. And that's why you can have a higher tidal volume but have a lower driving pressure because you have such a high respiratory system compliance. This is in a review paper recently published and showed how TCAV is personalized and adaptive. Now this is in patients. This is what we believe is happening. So we put this is a brain dead lung donor. We put the patient on TCAV immediately. This is immediately on TCAV, and we feel that the lung had a great deal of collapse over 12 hours with that extended time at T high. We nudged those viscoelastic alveoli open, so we have much less collapse. And at 24 hours, we find full lung open. So we gradually open that lung using time and pressure over a 24-hour period. And the actual tidal volumes per kilo in these each of these points was 7.3. So notice that when the lung is collapsed, the TCAV method is going to give you a low tidal volume. It's just CPAP. So CPAP is not, there are no ventilatory signals in there, so it's just CPAP. So if you have a stiff collapsed lung, TCAV is going to give you a low tidal volume breath. However, as the lung opens up, the tidal volume increases to 9.2, and it's fully open to 10.1. So is this injurious as defined by driving pressure? So you can see in our first example, and again, these are from actual brain dead lung donor patients. We see when we first went on TCAV, the driving pressure was 16, but the tidal volume was low. And why was the driving pressure sort of at the upper range of safe? Is because the compliance was so low. Over a 12-hour period, driving pressure went down, even though tidal volume went up. Why? It's because the compliance significantly increased. And at 24 hours, when they got the full lung open, driving pressure is now normal. It's a driving pressure of a normal lung and a compliance of a normal lung. So as you can see, using the TCAV method, your tidal volume, your driving pressure, your respiratory systems are utilized in order to customize that breath over time, whether the lung is actually improving or getting worse. In this case, it's constantly improving. A second brain dead lung donor on conventional ventilation had a driving pressure 26. You can see that the X-rays is greatly whited out, a very, very sick lung. 3 hours on TCAV, the lung is starting to recruit, driving pressure starting to drop. 29 hours, lungs further recruited, driving pressure is down further. 84 hours, lung is totally open, and a driving pressure of 11. So again, this is actual data on brain dead lung donors on how the TCAV method is personalized and adaptive to changes in lung physiology. This is from a case study at Upstate Medical University by one of the fellows that trained in my laboratory. And he used TCAV for severe ARDS on ECMO. And this is, again, published in a review paper recently in Frontiers. And as you see, the patient in the first slide here was on ECMO for 15 days and on PCAC mode for 21, had a PO2 of 59 and a PF ratio of 196. On ECMO for another 15 days, and the PF ratio has gone from 196 to 75. So we're going in the wrong direction. You can see, obviously, the whited out lung. We got a little bit of recovery here, but still very, very sick lung. Now notice we went on TCAV for 2 days. The lung is starting to recruit. You can see the lung opening up. It's surely the whiteout is starting to decrease, and PF ratio goes up to 275. On day 11, the lung is fully recruited. PF ratio is 414. The patient was decannulated, extubated, and went home. So you can see how the TCAV method can rapidly turn a very sick patient around. Patient that's been on ECMO for 30 days. Gradually nudge the lung open over several days. Usually doesn't take that long, but when you've been a lung this sick, it's going to take a while. And within 11 days, it actually helped this lung to recover so that it could be extubated and the patient survived. So what we feel is that you have this unstable lung due to edema and surfactant deactivation. And if you can simply stabilize the broken lung like you stabilize a broken bone and let it heal in the open and stable position, that villi would be eliminated and you would greatly reduce morbidity and mortality associated with ARDS. So again, remember the ARDS lung becomes time and pressure dependent, so it's going to collapse quickly at atmospheric pressure. So if we cast it open with this extended time at inspiration and very short time at expiration, we'll let the lung heal in its open state, eliminating the stress multipliers and recruitment, de-recruitment, and we believe would significantly reduce ARDS mortality. So to summarize the talk to this point, key thing to remember is that alveolar lung mechanic or alveoli change volume is a viscoelastic system. So there's a time lag between alveolar opening and alveolar collapse. Therefore, a long inspiratory time with open alveoli and a short expiratory time would simply not give them enough time to recollapse. And we found that our TCAV method to set and adjust the APRV mode using our knowledge of this viscoelastic change in volumes is highly effective at stabilizing the broken lung, reducing villi and morbidity associated with ARDS. The TCAV method is far and away the most studied method to set and adjust the APRV mode, and we've shown that it's both personalized and adaptive. And multiple mechanism studies and efficacy studies in my lab have shown this to be true. And again, I just showed you the statistical analysis of the patients in the SICU and the brain dead lung donors. So it seems to be very effective in humans also. So the bottom line, can mechanical ventilation reduce villi? The TCAV method, we find that our patients come out very healthy and happy, whereas conventional ventilation, not so much. And with that, I'm going to just give you just a very quick introduction or synopsis of can the TCAV method be used for patients with COVID-induced ARDS or CARDS. A quick recap of our knowledge to date of how SARS-CoV-2 actually damages the lung and causes the ARDS. It enters through the ACE2 receptors, causes a massive cytokine release of the cytokine storm. This leads to capillary leak and actually injury and death to the endothelial cells, which exposes the basement membrane, which leads to thrombosis. So it's a very big clotting issue also. There seems to be two generic categories of COVID-induced pneumonia, this type L, which has low elastance, low VQ ratio, low lung weight, and low recruitability. And the low VQ with this mostly open lungs felt to be due to loss of hypoxic pulmonary vasoconstriction. And then there's a type H with high elastance, high right to left shunt, high lung weight, and high recruitability. And the lung weight or the edema and the collapse is very similar to what you see in standard ARDSs. And again, this is somewhat debatable. Most clinicians that I've talked to have seen this. Most publications are talking about this, but not all. And again, we've only started studying COVID-induced ARDS and pneumonia since March, so there hasn't been much time to really define it. But this seems to be a distinct possibility. So what we see in the type L is we see an open lung. And what we see in the type H is the dependent atelectasis, just like you'd see in other forms of ARDS. Strange thing is, in the type L, we get very low PF ratios similar to those that we see in the type H. So how do we get these very low PF ratios in an open lung? So what groups have shown, this is published in Lancet Infectious Diseases, and this is a COVID patient. They show areas of collapse. And strangely, they show in these areas of collapse, an increase in perfusion is the darker red. So we're actually seeing an increase in perfusion to the collapsed tissue. So not just a diversion of perfusion from these areas, actually an increased or a hyperperfusion in these areas. So could hyperperfusion of this lung tissue, could it explain this silent hypoxia, a poor oxygenation plus a mostly open lung? Gattinoni has shown that patients can have compliances as high, respiratory system compliance as high as 50 and still have a 50% shunt. It's highly unusual. Speculation is that we have this impaired hypoxic pulmonary vasoconstriction. And so the recent papers published using a computational model to see if this makes sense. If you could actually get hyperperfusion of the small areas of collapse and actually cause a 50% shunt. And in this study, and again, it's a computer model, they showed the aerated portion of the tissue in the black and the non-aerated in gray. And so with normal HPV, you would get low flow to the non-perfused. With impaired, you'd get increased flow. And with APRV, HPV reversed, you would actually get a huge increase in the perfusion of the collapsed tissue. And so what they showed was that indeed the only way that you could get this very large increase in shock, 50%, was if you had hyperperfusion to the small amount of collapsed areas. And again, this has been shown by others also more recently. So the results from the COVID studies are there's extreme pulmonary shunting. It's not plausible with hyperperfusion of the small amount of fracture lungs. So it's not just loss of HPV, but actually a hyperperfusion due to vasodilation in these tissues. You can get actually a threefold increase in perfusion to collapsed tissues. And the pulmonary embolisms that are measured in many of these patients surely can exacerbate this problem. So to summarize, COVID causes a diffuse alveolar damage, or DAD, with perivascular T cell infiltrations, severe endothelial injury with viruses in the cell and cell membranes. This leads to thrombosis and microangiopathy. Also, large thrombus and microthrombi are seen, and angiogenesis and new growth vessels are also seen. So it has a lot of unique pathophysiologies that are not associated with ARDS caused from bacterial sepsis or shock or trauma. So to summarize, we have an endothelial cell with an ACE2 receptor, the SARS-CoV-2 attaches to the ACE2 receptor and it gets into the cell, killing the cell, causing loss of HPV function. The endothelial cell and the smooth muscle work hand in glove in order to control HPV, and it's hypothesized if there's a lot of cell death that the muscle isn't going to respond properly. Also damage the endothelial cell, you're going to get edema, surfactant deactivation, microatelectasis, and alveolar instability, of course causing those drivers of Billy, of recruitment, de-recruitment, and stress multipliers. You're also going to get pulmonary embolism. And since you're going in through the ACE2 receptor, you're going to get a negative impact on the renin-angiotensin II system dysfunction, which also controls vascular perfusion. And together, some combination of these or other things we haven't identified yet seem to alter pulmonary perfusion, causes VQ mismatch. So will TCAV work on the CARDS patient? I just don't know. We just don't have enough patients that have been put on TCAV from the beginning of their case and to the end. We've had some very successful cases of turnarounds at Upstate. The same pulmonary fellow that I showed you with the ECMO had a young girl with COVID that was about to be cannulated in ECMO and put her on TCAV, spared her for ECMO, and she's back at class now. So it was a very exciting, big win for us. Since TCAV is personalized adaptive, it should work just as well for the L to the H type. It's going to give you low tidal volume. It's going to give you low pressures and higher volumes in the L, and higher pressures and lower volumes in the H until the lung opens up. However, I don't believe that TCAV is going to fix these perfusion abnormalities. That's a problem we have to worry about in the future. And again, just so you have a list of the papers, I think that ICON will give you these. I'm sure I'm fine if they do. These are mechanistic studies looking at the mechanism of TCAV at the alveolar level. These are efficacy studies looking at is TCAV more efficacious than other methods of ventilation in large animal models. And these are reviews articles on the use of TCAV. So with that, I would like to end my lecture and try to answer any questions, and thank you for your attention.
If you jump back into your browser and then click down over on the little question icon, you'll see 2 questions in there. And if people can click on that icon and add your questions in there, that'll make this simpler. We'll have the code up in just a second.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll bring up the questions if I can get that. Gary, you there?
Yep, I'm here.
Alrighty. I can't see that one about the pH. Gary, can you see the question about the pH?
There's a lot of thank yous coming up. I'm not sure. I mean, it may have been.
So
Went
Gary,
by.
if you look at the icons on the left-hand side, there's
Right.
a question. There's one like a speech box with a question mark. If you click on that,
I don't see anything.
you may have to